Just an audio check. Let me know if you can hear me okay. We're going to get started in just a second. Nice. All right, so welcome to the live stream. As you know, we are doing Docker on this stream. This is one of the stream topics that's been requested a lot of this channel to do as a live stream, and I thought it was a fantastic idea. I had done a couple Docker videos in the past, and so this is kind of the 1 hour Q&A version of Docker. So a lot of questions were submitted, about I think 41 in total, which I was able to compress down to about 30 or so, 28 or so. So everybody that asked a question through the Google form is having that answered today, and then we'll also try to answer some questions from the chat kind of as we go. So as I was watching chat for the last 8 minutes, I noticed a lot of people saying, well, what is Docker? So it's probably worth mentioning, if it's your first time on the stream or your first time ever hearing about Docker, then Docker is this kind of new way to create things that are kind of like virtual machines, but are a lot lighter weight. You don't have to install them yourselves, and you can produce custom images based on other images. And a Docker image is nothing more than a thing that contains software that's designed to run when you start a container. So it's kind of this flexible way to create really specific things in a contained environment, rather than using software directly on your computer, which of course you have to version on your own. And all these lightweight images can be had from a central repository called the Docker Hub, and that makes things real easy. So that's kind of what Docker is. And then the stream today, what we're doing is I'm fielding questions from people, and a lot of people asked a lot of the same questions, so that's good. That means that it's something that I'll talk a lot about. So we'll talk about that as it progresses. So as far as channel announcements, I only had one, and I can't remember exactly what it was. Of course, I didn't write it down because I just thought about it a couple of minutes ago. Okay, I don't remember what it is. If I think about it, I will let you know what that announcement was. As far as if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat using the Q question or question colon, and then they'll pop up on Discord. I do want to make sure that I answer the questions for the folks that did submit it through the Google form, but as I go, I'll make sure that I get some questions from the chat as well. And if I see something worth discussing, or if you see something you'd like me to clarify from somebody else's question, you should definitely post that in the chat, and I will get that on Discord. And I will make sure I answer it. Oh, I remember what the announcement was. So our Discord server was entered into a program called Server Discovery. This is a Discord, like Discord the company rather than Discord the server. It's their new feature, so people can publicly find the Engineer Man Discord server now. And what this has resulted in is huge growth in the amount of people that are on the server. So if you ever felt like you wanted to come help somebody out, or get help, or just join in some discussions, there's never been a better time, because the activity on the server has never been higher, because it's full of people who are searching for a server specifically for discussion, rather than joining the server because they just like the Engineer Man channel. So definitely check that out if you have a sec. So let me switch over to my... So yeah, we're pretty much just going to jump right into the questions. So first question was from Shreyas. Why can't I include more than one image in my Dockerfile? So the reason this is the case is because the whole point of a Dockerfile is to describe like what an image is. It's supposed to describe what its base image is, and then the additional software that you want to add to your image. This is what's in the Dockerfile. The other thing the Dockerfile can contain is what script it should run once the container starts. And that's often called the entry point. And this is important because for a container to function properly, it needs to have one thing to run, exactly one thing. It starts one thing, and then once that one thing ends, then the container ends. And that's kind of how Docker containers work. So answer to this question is because it's not intended to. If you wanted to use more than one image, what you'd have to do is you'd have to first base one Dockerfile on one image and then base a second Dockerfile on that image that you just created. But this probably isn't what you want to do anyways. You'd probably want to base it on one proper Docker image that comes from Docker Hub, something like CentOS or Ubuntu, Alpine, or Debian, something like that, and then build the stuff that you need into that. And then you'd have the image that you could just use to make containers from. Let's see. Okay. So next question was from Unknown. How exactly would you go around persistence and managing permanent storage? For now, I've just been binding a folder with the Docker Compose to the container. Would you recommend any other ways? So this is actually the perfect way already. One of the concepts of Docker is that the container itself will have some files in it already that it gets from the image. And that can be configuration files, like take the MySQL image, for instance. It comes from Docker Hub. That's going to have some baseline configuration built in, and then it's going to write the database to the same folder they would write if you had installed it on your machine. The problem with that is once you turn a container on and then you write some records into the database, the issue is that once that container stops, it's going to delete all that data. Like, containers leave nothing behind. The way you make it leave stuff behind is you can mount specific folders to an area on the host. And so what you do is, if you want to use MySQL with Docker, you would mount a place for it to store the database files. And then if you had updated configuration, you would mount a configuration file on top of the configuration file in the container. And so what that would give you is the container that's using your config and is storing its data in a place where it can just pick up where it left off next time the container starts. And this is the way where you wouldn't lose the stuff that you've done. So whoever asked this question, you're already doing it the perfect way. Just keep doing it that way. One question I saw from the chat that I wanted to answer because it's sort of fun. Louise asked, is it possible to build a workstation with Docker containers? And it's interesting you ask that question because there's actually an operating system out there. I think it's called Rancher OS. And it's a Linux operating system that is built entirely with Docker containers. So anything that's on the operating system is being serviced via a Docker container. And it's kind of an interesting concept, and from what I understand, it does work. I've never personally tried it out, but you can check it out. It's called Rancher OS, and that's exactly what that does. The whole operating system is just a collection of Docker containers. So definitely check that out. It's kind of interesting concept. I don't know if it has any use, but somebody did it, so. Okay, Kev asked, and this is Kev Rocks from the server. What should I remember when deploying a Dockerized project to production in terms of security and reliability? So there's a couple things that come to mind when I think about creating a secure Docker container and creating a reliable one. So Docker by default is already pretty secure. It has a bunch of strong security guarantees built into it, and unless you relax these, it can more or less be thought of secure out of the box. However, there are some, usually when you have security issue with Docker, it's because you did something to open a security problem. So this is rather than what you should do to make it secure, it's what you should not do to make it not secure. Ben Archer, can I move a Docker image from a Linux system to a Windows 10 system? The answer is absolutely. So Docker, like if you make an image, you're making it for Docker to run. So yes, like you can run a CentOS image built with all your own software. You can run that, and then you can move it to Windows. It'll run there. You can move it to Linux. You can move it to a different Linux distribution. It doesn't really matter. As long as it's a Docker image, then you're good to go. That's one of Docker's sort of core things, is the ability to have images that run anywhere Docker runs. So yes, absolutely. And also thank you for the, I'm not sure what currency it is. Thank you for the 50. I think it's $5. Thank you for the 5. Yeah, so back to the question, security and reliability. As far as security, the things I think about is I want to make sure that I only expose the ports that are necessary. And sometimes people expose ports for reasons that they don't actually need. They'll say, okay, well, I have a MySQL container, and I know that runs on port 3306, so I should probably expose port 3306. But this might not be correct, because if you have a MySQL container, and it's designed to be used by an application container, then what you can do is you can create a Docker virtual network. You can put both those containers on that network, and then what they can do is they can address each other by name. And by doing so, you don't actually have to expose any ports on the container at all, because the networks make it so that they can share things already. So when you expose ports, really what you're doing is you're exposing ports for the host system to access. And depending on your environment, this could be a potential problem. So first thing is keep them on the same network. As far as reliability is, you got to have a plan if your app crashes. So typically if you build an application, you'll write some sort of thing that will start up your application when the system starts, or it'll restart in an event of error. With Docker, it's kind of one extra step. So as far as Docker goes, you gotta make it so Docker will restart your container automatically, but you also have to make it so Docker starts up automatically. So you should make sure that both those are true to make sure that your containers stay running when you need them to. Boris asks, can I Dockerize a legacy Windows app? That's a good question. I don't know actually. Like how old? I'm not sure. If you can clarify in the chat, I might be able to help. Shreyas, where's the GoPro mounted on Shay's live stream? I feel like I want to do something fun at the end of each live stream. The problem is, like, Chase never stays in one spot. I thought I could like cut to a camera that's facing at Chase. It's just Chase is never where you expect him to be, so it'd be very difficult to actually find Chase at any given time. But yeah, I think that'd be fun. So next question was asked by, I think it's Joao. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry if I messed up your name. What are the main differences between application containers and OS level containers, e.g. Docker versus LXC? Could you show a typical use case for containers? So the one misconception is that Docker is some like massive new infrastructure that they built from scratch, when in reality, Docker actually uses LXC internally. So it's already using Linux containers. Everything that you get with Linux containers, you also get with Docker, because that's what it's using anyways. So you can almost think of Docker as the infrastructure that surrounds LXC. Because if you've ever used LXC, then you know that it's not the easiest thing to use, and certainly distributing your LXC stuff has some extra steps. So Docker kind of looked at all these issues. Not issues. I mean, LXC is great. I use it. I use just LXC sometimes. Like Piston, the open source tool that's used with Felix Run actually uses LXC directly. It does not use Docker. So I have no problems with it. I don't think it has any issues. I just think that it could be made easier, and I think that's what Docker intended to do. So Docker took this idea of just containers that you make on your computer, and they added the whole like build and run and distribute and deploy. They added all those steps as infrastructure around LXC to create this tool that makes it easier to work with containers. And since LXC wasn't widely adopted as the container system of choice, and that Docker was, kind of shows that Docker really did get it right, in my opinion. I think that they did the right stuff at the right time, and that's why Docker's wildly popular, and that's why there's been a number of different tools that are infrastructure around Docker, such as Kubernetes and Docker Swarm and those sorts of things. Liam, yeah, I do have a server that runs a bunch of things in my home. My personal projects, of course, the community Minecraft server, as well as some other things. Okay, this was a question that I got a lot, or something similar to this. Is a lot of people asked, is Docker some kind of VM? What's a virtual machine versus Docker? Is Docker better than a virtual machine? What do I get with a virtual machine instead of Docker? I got a lot of those questions, and the more general one comes later in the stream. But this one, is Docker runtime some kind of VM? And the answer is similar but different. So typically when you think of a virtual machine, what you're thinking about is a complete operating system that's installed on a virtual disk and has virtual RAM that's reserved for its purpose. So a virtual machine can be thought of like a normal computer. It's entirely a normal computer. And with Docker, that's not really the case. So right off the bat, Docker containers are only intended to run the minimum that it needs to produce some particular outcome, like starting a database or starting an application. And it removes all the additional fluff. It doesn't have anything in it that doesn't absolutely require to do that exact thing. And the reason that's the case is because you got to distribute these containers, or rather these images. And you don't want to distribute, 2 GB images and make people depend on 2 GB images. So people produce these really stripped down versions of everything that only really require, sometimes as little as 10 or 20 megabyte, or on the high end, maybe 90 or so, but definitely not gigabytes. And the other difference is that Docker does not, like, you can limit the things that Docker can do. You can say that Docker, you can only use up to 1 core. You can say that you can only use this much RAM, but it's different than a VM. With Docker, like if you log into a Docker container and you run top or free to see the free memory, you'll notice that the free memory is the same free memory from the host. It's actually the same memory. Whereas a virtual machine, you're actually carving out a portion of RAM. You're saying, okay, this virtual machine gets 4 GB, and then that's it. And that memory is reserved and it can't be used by the other system. When you log into the virtual machine only sees 4 GB. It's an actual limit to the virtual machine. So it's a little bit different. Like if you had 16 gig of RAM and you wanted 16 1 GB virtual machines, that's all you could do. But with Docker, you could start up 1,000 containers and it'd be okay, as long as the 1,000 containers don't use in total more than 16 gigabytes of RAM, then you're okay. So it's kind of a difference in the way resources are and kind of a difference in the way they're used. Let me check chat questions. Oh, Roma asks, how does Docker affect performance? So we're actually going to talk about that in a separate question, so we'll get back to that. Firegiver asks, can you run Docker on Android or iOS? I'm gonna say no for normal, like Android, but I assume I don't know if Docker supports. So Docker does depend on having certain virtualization stuff available to it, and it relies on CPU virtualization stuff as well. What I don't know is if ARM supports those sorts of things. I actually don't know. That's a good question. I'm going to check on that later. Thank you for that question. And then Sarthak asked, will Docker be able to replace my VM one day? And the answer is possibly. If your VM is, well, so Docker is used within a VM. So can it replace a full VM? No, because you can't like boot into Docker, so to speak. You'd have to have a VM, but then instead of having the software on that VM that you'd ordinarily have, you would build it into a Docker container and run it there. So it couldn't fully replace VMs. However, Docker can replace a lot of the software that you install to a VM once you go to use it. Actually, that's a good point. I guess if Docker works on Raspberry Pi, then that is fine. So that means that rooted Android phones can probably run Docker on Android. Yeah, I don't see why that wouldn't work then. I completely forgot about the Raspberry Pi. Thanks for reminding me about that. And that is definitely ARM architecture, same as the phone. So Nice. So the answer to that question is yes. You should be able to run Docker on Android as long as you can SSH into your Android and get root access. Then you should be able to install Docker, and that would be very interesting. Avi asked a couple questions as well. We're gonna get to them later. How to use Docker properly? What's the popular use cases? I'm gonna cover all of that kind of as we go. Oh, okay. Yeah, could you give an everyday example of what Docker is used for? Yes, we're gonna get to that. Don't worry. Okay, so back to normal questions. From a dev's perspective, what typical scenarios would you use Docker for? Why not Vagrant? And I'm glad Sip Kodak brought up that. We're gonna talk about Vagrant here in a second. One big difference between Docker and Vagrant is that Docker containers run on Linux, but Vagrant files can contain any operating system. Yes, that's correct. So the reason Vagrant was sort of, Vagrant's been around for a while, and people use that for a lot of things, but people saw Vagrant more as getting a VM up to date according to a particular template. And they leveraged the feature with CloudHost that allowed you to basically upload custom images of an operating system, or create specific environments on an operating system that's already there. That's what Vagrant was really good at. But Vagrant did so with like legitimate virtual machines. And because it did so with legitimate virtual machines, that's why you could use any operating system with Vagrant. So, the answer to why not Vagrant is simply because it's still a full-on virtual machine, and that may not be what you want. As far as running numerous containers and having them seamlessly connect to one another and just sort of work is not one of Vagrant's strong points. Whereas with Docker, it's what it is at its core. So, and Vagrant's still in use today. Like, Vagrant's definitely not dead technology. Vagrant still has a good use. It's just, it's not Docker. And if what you need is lightweight containers that you can start and stop quickly, then Docker is going to be the solution that you need, and not so much Vagrant. But thank you for the question. I'm glad you brought up Vagrant, because that's very important, because that is, so some people see Vagrant as a competitor to Docker, but they sort of do different things, and I think in some cases they can even interact with one another. They can work well together. Docker does some things good, Vagrant does some things good, and I think that's perfectly fine. Yeah, Vagrant sort of, so perhaps it's on life support. So Vagrant, I think, the first time I used Vagrant, I think was probably 2010, maybe 2011, like a long time ago, and I really haven't used it since, but this was kind of before, this is before the advent of like cloud everything and containerized architecture and this and that. Vagrant was more like, oh, let's create a Vagrant box so we all have the same environment. And it was a terrific concept, and it did resolve the one thing that Docker resolves, and that's the works on my machine problem. We'll talk more about that later. AH asks, are the ports the only way containers can communicate? Yes, but that's because that's how, well, I guess they can communicate through shared volumes. If both are mounting the same volume, then they could certainly use the same files there. But typically, containers will operate through ports. Usually things that run on a container have some port where you can access that thing that's on the container. So if you have MySQL, it'll operate on port 3306. If you have Redis, it'll operate on port 5379 or whatever it is. I probably got that port wrong, but it doesn't matter. But they can also address each other by name, and that's kind of the really cool thing. So if your MySQL container is just called MySQL, and it's on the same network as your app container, your app can just reference it by MySQL. It doesn't have to worry about IP, doesn't have to worry about anything like that. So that's kind of a cool thing. Okay, next question. This was asked by Pyro, Semi, and some other people as well. So creating virtual machines is closer to bare metal and far outperform Docker, so why should Docker even be considered? Well, for one, so the data seems to show something a little different. The idea that bare metal is orders of magnitude faster than Docker is simply not true. There's been a couple studies. The primary one was done by IBM, and they found that pretty much in all cases other than networking, Docker was, for all intents and purposes, the same speed, and the performance penalty was more or less non-existent. There was a small penalty, but not enough to justify not using Docker. Its benefits more than made up for any potential performance penalty. The reason there's a networking penalty is because there is a networking layer, a network address translation layer. And this is how all the Docker containers can share one system IP, but they can still connect out to the internet, kind of individually. So to do that, they did have to add a network layer, and this does introduce some performance penalty in terms of networking. But as far as processing and things like that, not really. That's completely fine. Another question from Pyro was, Docker is great as a concept, but can you give some really good use cases for it? Not something generic that all websites like to give, but something more meaningful. So when I saw this question, I thought to myself, well, let me tell you kind of what I use Docker for, why I started using it. Because I'm not one to pick up technology just for the sake of picking it up. I usually pick up new technology because it's going to benefit me in some way in the things that I do. So as far as Docker goes, I use Docker for 3 reasons. The first is I use it to resolve the so-called works on my machine problem that's in dev. If anybody in this chat is on a dev team or working with other people, then you've 100% for sure had an issue where somebody you're working with says, oh, I have a problem, I'm getting this error over here, and then you go check it on your machine and it works on your machine. And then you tell the person, I don't know, it works on my machine. So this is a major problem. This is a problem everywhere. And it's usually because people's environments that they're working on, they're never exactly the same. They always have maybe some minor version different, or they're using a different flavor of Linux, or one guy's on Windows and one guy's on Linux, or there's a slight difference in database version. And all these things kind of add up, and they create this perfect storm of, it works on one machine but not the other. So because Docker is very specific versions, running under Docker in a Linux container, or in the case of Windows, Hyper-V, you don't really have this works on my machine issue because everybody is guaranteed to have the exact same environment. And this is a really powerful thing because you can just give people a bunch of Docker files in your application and they can start up all the necessary containers and everything should just work. And this is a very powerful thing. Yeah, the one guy in Windows, exactly. So there's always going to be differences in environment, and this is a way of reconciling that. And now keep in mind that even if you're a solo dev, you can still benefit from the works on my machine problem, because remember, if you have a dev machine and you have a production machine, those might be different environments, and you'll want to resolve the problem of it working on your local but not on production, and you can resolve that with Docker. Second is, Second is if you need to run a variety of versions under the same machine, then Docker's very powerful. So imagine you have a cloud host and you have a bunch of people that you're hosting. Maybe you're hosting like 10 websites. You're hosting a couple Node.js 8 applications, a couple Node.js 10 applications, a PHP 5 application, a PHP 7 application. The PHP 5 requires MySQL 5.5. The PHP 7 application requires MySQL 8. Your Node.js applications are still on MySQL 5.7. You have all these different versions and you're running them all on the same machine. How do you reason about all those versions? Obviously it would be very difficult to run 3 versions of MySQL. It'd be very difficult to run 3 versions of Node, 2 versions of PHP, 2 web servers. Not ideal. So when you have Docker, you can have a set of Docker containers over here that run PHP 7 and MySQL 8, and that's it. They sit over there. They don't affect any other part of the machine. And then you have these containers that run Node.js 8 and MySQL 5.6. And then you have these containers over here that run maybe a Python program. And you can run all of these at the same time because the Docker containers don't clash with one another. And this has been very powerful for me because I host a lot of client sites on my business sites, and they all have different versions of stuff, and it's really difficult to reason about sometimes. Usually what I end up having to do is create multiple servers that contain different collections of software. And this is just wasteful because these are all low traffic sites, and it's just a waste of money to buy additional servers. So this has really helped me out in terms of running all these things without having any clashes. And then the third thing is, and this is a big one for me lately, is I want to ease deployments and being able to shuffle things between systems. This goes back to a question I got asked earlier about, can I move my image around? And the answer, of course, is yes. So what this allows me to do is, imagine I want to deprecate one of my cloud servers. If I want to move it to a separate system, it is a massive undertaking because I got to go back and I got to reinstall everything that I ever had on that system into the new system. And this, of course, is not ideal because your system might have been running for, say, 5 years and you have no clue what you even installed. And invariably, you're going to get some of the configuration wrong, and that's not good. With Docker, you just shift everything over. So lately, I've built all my cloud technology to be fully containerized. Basically, I don't allow it into my cloud server unless it runs in a Docker container. And what this has created is it's allowed me to run a bare metal server that runs SSH and Docker, and that's it, nothing else. And then everything else is serviced by Docker containers. And honestly, it's been fantastic so far. So that's the 3 things that I use Docker for that's really helped out. And this is probably 3 use cases that will help a lot of you as well. Diniz asked, I installed GitLab CE on a Hyper-V Windows and saw afterwards that there's a GitHub CE Docker image available. Would there be any benefits to switch to Docker? Well, GitLab. No. So I use the GitLab Docker image just because it's easier. I just git pull GitLab and then start it, and it's no big deal. So it's the same as actually kind of what I just talked about. You know, the image is just you pull the image and you're done. That's it. Whereas if you install GitLab on its own, you got to download all the files, you got to configure all the files, and then you got to make sure that you start and keep the server running. And this is just additional maintenance. You know, it's not a lot of maintenance. If you want to do that maintenance, it's fine. But if I were you, in this case, I mean, if you already have it running, it's probably not worth switching. But from the outset, if you can use the Docker container version, then it's probably better to use the Docker container version. But thank you for that question. Silver Dude asks, can I have one image, say B, with the same Docker compose file depend on another image, say A, after successful initialization of image A? So you can, yes. I don't remember the exact setting. I don't know if it depends on, I think it depends on. I don't remember the exact setting of Docker compose, but yes, if you have like container A, which depends on container B, then you can ensure that container A fully starts up before you start container B. And a lot of times this is required. It's a perfectly normal thing you have to do with Docker, and I'm 100% sure that Docker Compose supports that. I just don't remember the exact phrase. Actually, if you check the MKC, I believe it's in there. Okay, next question. Let's see. Please show how we can integrate this with CI/CD. For example, once a PR is merged, should that trigger a Jenkins job that runs a Dockerfile? How Docker fits into the overall picture is a bit fuzzy for me. This was asked by Shroot Farms. So typically, as far as I understand, test suites won't use Docker. They'll just test your code, because what they're doing is they're testing the functioning of your code. They're not testing necessarily the environment. You would have like acceptance tests for that. So the way Docker would fit into the whole CI/CD thing is your test would run on your code to make sure that the test passed and that the code's sane and working. And then on a successful pass, or just maybe, no matter whether it passes or fails, the system would then build a Docker image from the code that is now, in the CI system, probably your master branch. And then you'd build a Docker image from that, and then you could deploy that either to a testing server or staging server, or if the test passed and you're ready to deploy it, then CD would take over. It would push that out to your production server. Your production server would pull the latest image and restart the container, and that would be that. So that's how it kind of fits into that whole thing. The job still, it's probably just an extra step. Like a lot of people who are transitioning to Docker probably keep their test as is. They just build images from that and then push those to production. And then a related question was, if somebody's not using a CI/CD tool, is there a best practice for deployment of an application remotely while utilizing Docker? So if you're not using a tool that does this automatically, usually what I'd recommend is that you make sure that you have a single script that can start your application, and then you have a script that will basically deploy your latest changes, run an initialization, and then simply run like docker compose restart, something like that. And that's all you should need to do. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. Next question, and this is a good question. Docker seems to have created yet another layer of abstraction. Why reinvent the wheel? Now, this is a good question because I'm actually very sensitive to things that get abstracted, but there's good abstraction and there's bad abstraction. The bad abstraction is the stuff that abstracts things that are already very abstracted and creates things that are unworkable or strange to use, and then creates things or makes things that are now overly complex. But I think with Docker, the authors of Docker felt that this was necessary abstraction. This is something that would have a net positive. And I think they were right. And the evidence is in the fact that Docker is massively deployed everywhere. People are just eating it up. They've been eating it up since the day it came out, and they're building more and more technology on top of it. Now, they've built abstraction onto this abstraction in the form of like Kubernetes and Docker Swarm. That's an abstraction upon Docker, whereas Docker is an abstraction upon LXC. I think they did it right though. They're not doing it. They're not abstracting for abstraction's sake. They're abstracting because it makes sense in this case. LXC, as I mentioned earlier, can definitely be improved in the way users interface with it. LXC is kind of low level in that, its function is pretty basic. They didn't build the infrastructure around it. Docker did that. And then Kubernetes built more infrastructure around Docker. So here again, to each their own. Some people may think that Docker is not good. They don't like that it's abstracted things in the way that it's done it. And for those that don't like that, there are, of course, other options. There's also LXD, which is kind of like LXC, but it aims to function more like Docker. You can use that as well. Those other things. So that's the great thing about tech, is there's always options. You always have options. Okay, this next question was a good one. This was asked by Masood Anwar and AmpY. In what situations should we choose Docker, and when should we choose a virtual machine? So this is a great question, and it's a very common one. So for a virtual machine, you should choose that when you need an entire system, and you need to work with that entire system. You need to be persistent, and you need it to have dedicated resources. You need to have its own hard drive, you need to have its own RAM, and you need to run 100% independently of the system, and just that's what it does. So one of the things about Docker container is that Docker containers are not intended to run forever. Like, they're not intended to replace virtual machines. You don't start a Docker container and then use it like a normal system. That's not really what it's for. You start a Docker container to do one purpose, and then once it's done doing that purpose, it turns off. Whereas a virtual machine, you start a virtual machine up, and then it's intended to stay running, and it's intended to be worked on and improved as a machine. Like for Docker, you don't typically make improvements to the image or container within a running container because the changes you make are just going to disappear anyways. So Docker should be chosen when software needs to be ran in a very specific environment across systems, or when you need clusters of software. You know, like if you have an application and you're running on a 16-core machine and you want to run 16 instances of that application, running 16 virtual machines, of course, is not ideal. You'll eat up all your RAM, you'll eat up all your resources. Docker, on the other hand, can start 16 instances of the same container with relatively no overhead, other than what one container takes, which is basically nothing usually. So that's when you should choose Docker versus a virtual machine. This is a good question. I actually had to Google this. What keeps Docker relevant, especially since its procurement and half its feature set will be defunct post 22? And I didn't actually know what the person meant by this, but once I looked into it, so evidently Mirantis purchased Docker Enterprise. And because of that, they have decided to stop supporting Docker Swarm. But it's just Docker Swarm. So if you're using Docker Swarm, then yes, you're in trouble. You're going to have to transition off of that sometime in the next 2 years. But that's not half of its feature set. You know, Docker Core is still Docker Core. Docker Swarm is just some abstraction upon Docker. So even if, like, I've never used Docker Swarm, and a lot of people I don't think haven't either. A lot of people just use Docker Core, and Docker Core will still be very much relevant well into the future. So I think that this is largely a non-issue unless you're using Docker Swarm, in which case you can just refactor over to Kubernetes, and then now you're good to go, which I think is what they want you to use instead now. One question from the chat: have you tried Podman? Any opinion on Podman versus Docker? I've actually never heard of Podman, so if you could post a link to that, I'd be interested in checking it out. I've just never heard of it, so I can't speak to it. Sorry about that. Another question from the chat was, right now I have all my volumes set up as ./data, even for databases like MySQL. Is this bad practice, and could it make my DB slow? No. Where you mount your volumes wouldn't necessarily make it slow. However, it may make it messy. So if you have all your data mounted to the same folder, then you run into a possibility where two containers will need a folder of the same name, and then it'll be writing all its files within the same folder. And that's probably not ideal. It's not going to make it any slower, but it may corrupt it. Obviously, if a container overwrites a file that your database depends on, then that would not be ideal. So the best way to do it, typically what I do is if I have an application container and I have a database container and an object cache container and something else, what I'll do is I'll create a folder for each of those things, and then I'll make sure that that's mounted to that particular folder. And in that way, I can guarantee that the MySQL files will stay in the MySQL folder. I can guarantee that the object cache files will stay in the object cache folder, and then none of them will ever clash, and everything will be great. How would you manage volumes for different containers? So if you're using just Docker, if you're using just straight Docker, you would mount the volumes at the time you run the container. If you're using Docker Compose, then you can describe all of the mounts within your Docker Compose YML file. And one thing we're going to get to later is that I recommend each person just go straight for Docker Compose, just completely ignore Docker Core just entirely to start out with. Just go straight for Compose. One moment, just a second. Yeah, so Docker run takes a -v argument, and that's what gives you the volumes. But Docker compose also does volumes as well. So that's how you would do it. So if your database needs to mount a particular folder, you would do so in that way, and the same as the rest. But that's how you manage it between containers. If you need two containers to access the same data, then of course you can just mount the same folder. Okay, next, there's another question from AmpY. What would be the best resource for someone who's totally new in Docker apart from my stream and the channel? So the Docker documentation is actually very comprehensive, and it's worth looking at. And not only is it comprehensive in terms of reference guides and this and that, but it also has a bunch of tutorials. If you want to learn about Docker concepts, learn how to do basic Docker things, you can find that all within the documentation. It's sort of a one-stop shop. So that's, I would say, the best place to start. And of course, there's a litany of different, YouTube videos and Docker materials that are not by the Docker people that you can certainly check out as well. Where are my questions? Questions are disappearing on Discord, sorry. Why is Kubernetes popular? That's a good question. So I've never used Kubernetes. I know that it's for deploying tons of containers and making sure that they're all orchestrated properly and doing everything they need to be doing. I think it's popular because once you have tens or hundreds of containers across tens or even hundreds of servers, I guess, then the maintenance of all that becomes quite tough, especially if your infrastructure runs entirely on Docker. So Kubernetes aims to solve that, and it lets you manage all that kind of from one spot. And they act, again, I don't have a ton of experience in Kubernetes other than just cursory knowledge from reviewing documentation and whatnot. But yeah, that's why it's popular. Kubernetes is going to have a ton of use cases in enterprise. Those are going to be the people who are going to mostly use it. I can't imagine solo developers with one server and a couple of containers would ever have a benefit for Kubernetes, but maybe they would. The next question from Kufaron is there a way I can assign a specific internal Docker IP to a container every time it restarts without using DHCP type container? So the answer is yes, and the direct answer can be seen in my third point here. You could just use the --IP flag, and that will let you assign an IP to that container, but it's probably not what you want. So Docker has been designed in such a way to where you don't really have to worry about IPs because you're not usually addressing a Docker container by IP. You're addressing it by a port that's been mounted on the computer. So like, if you wanted to use a MySQL Docker container and you wanted to use it in place of MySQL installed on your system, what you could do is you could run a Docker container. You could run a Docker container on. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so you would run a Docker container and you would say expose port 3306, for instance. And what that would do is that would allow you to connect to the host's 3306, which would forward to the container's 3306. And this would be a way to use a Docker container from your host without having to actually contact it by IP. And you could just assume that the host's local port points to the container. And you could do this with a lot of things. You could also even forward ports, like you could forward port 2000 to the container's internal 3306, something like that. So you often don't need to even contact the container because you're just doing it all through ports. And then if you're talking about like one container contacting the other, you just do so by name. If you have a container called container A and you have a container called container B, then you could just call container B from container A and call container A from container B and not have to worry about the IP at all. But if you absolutely must have an IP for your container, the answer is --IP. Zach asks, is Docker still a relevant technology? I see it as useful in some applications, but when it comes down to it, a full-blown web server can do just so much more. What modern uses does it have now? So that is true. A full-on system, a full-on VM, it is in fact going to do more. It's just, it's in a way, that's the problem, is that it doing more is the problem. And the reason Docker is relevant is because Docker lets you, in a very lightweight fashion, start up services in a very consistent manner, consistent in terms of versioning, consistent in terms of configuration, and then it lets you expand these to other systems without having to reinstall a bunch of stuff. Like, it can't be understated how simple it is to run complex software structure with Docker. And you can just move it to an entirely separate system and do Docker compose up, and then that's it, you're done. So that's what makes it relevant, is it makes that really, really easy. Now, the other thing is, I wasn't sure if the author of this question meant web server as in virtual machine or web server as in like Nginx or Apache. If the author meant Nginx or Apache, it's actually normal. I do it. Is what I'll do is I'll run my web server bare metal. So I'll run Nginx bare metal, and I'll use that as the front end to a bunch of containers. So like, I'll have Nginx listening on 80 and 443. I'll have a number of virtual hosts with the reverse proxy, which will send the request to the proper container. So then I'll have all my containers running on like port 1000, port 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, all the way up to, you know, however many containers I have. And so by doing it that way, that lets me still operate the web server bare metal, and just the servicing containers run kind of, you know, in the back end. One more second, please. But that's a great question. You know, and Zach's absolutely right. You know, virtual machines do a lot more things than Docker does, but that's not necessarily, like, you can create a Docker container that does everything that a virtual machine does. It's just, that's probably not what you want anyways. That's not usually, you know, what Docker would be for. Let me check questions here. That's a good question. Kaylee asks, where do you draw the line for breaking up containers to do one thing well? MySQL server, MySQL client. Do you spin up a client container to access the database, keep the server lean? So usually what I'll do is I'll let my software do the talking, you know. So if I have software that is going to use MySQL, then obviously I'm going to use the vendor's provided MySQL image. It makes perfect sense that that's what you do. So as far as your own code, now keep in mind that the MySQL container that's provided by the vendor, it'll also contain the MySQL client. So if you want to use if you want to access the database, you wouldn't use the MySQL client command on your host. You would simply connect to it using its own MySQL client, so you'd be okay then. And as far as your own application, think about it in terms of ports. So if your application exposes 2 ports, then they should probably be 2 containers, one container doing each. But if your application just exposes a single port, like in the case of an application or something like that, then it probably makes sense for it to just be all one container. And try to think of it as like services that are serviced over a given port, and then kind of build your container infrastructure from there. But no, I wouldn't go too crazy with it. You know, you're only using, you got to remember like what you're using Docker for. You're trying to make it easy for you to deploy things. You're making it easy to version, and you're making it easy to develop in. So you're not really using it to like make things lean, because there's no way Docker is faster than bare metal, for instance. So, you know, in no case will more containers lead to better performance. That's just simply not true. But thank you for the question. That's a good question. All right, next question from Drakelovich, I think is how to pronounce it. My company is looking to expand into Docker. That said, what would be some advice, pitfalls you'd think to avoid? Words of wisdom for someone whose only experience has been taking the fundamentals class Mirantis offers. I'm on the dev side, so I'm mainly just building containers and handing them off for more configuration. So my very first piece of advice, which I actually mentioned earlier, but not in this context, is just skip Docker altogether and go straight for Docker Compose, even if you're just doing a single container. And it's because Docker Compose lets you, basically anything that you can do with Docker run, you can structure in a file that makes it easy to start a container. You can set up all your volumes, you can do all those sorts of things. But then when you want to go to two containers, Docker Compose by default will link those containers together, and that's very useful. So just skip Docker run entirely and just do Docker Compose. And then one pitfall to avoid is attempting to use a Docker container like a virtual machine. A lot of people who are new at Docker, they're tempted to start a container and then log into the container to work in that container as if it were a virtual machine. And that's not really how it's intended to work. You know, Docker containers are intended to run on their own. They should start one thing. So if I have a Docker container for my application, the Docker container will start up and it will run my application in the foreground. And in the foreground is important because once my application ends, the container should turn off. So don't use a Docker container like a virtual machine. You know, use it for what it's intended to be. And the last thing is make sure you use volumes to avoid using data. A lot of people will mount their volumes incorrectly, or they won't use volumes at all. And then when their container restarts, they'll be surprised that all of their data is gone. So not ideal. So make sure that when you're using Docker or Docker Compose, make sure you're mounting volumes for all the data that you want to persist between instances of the container. And this is typically like log data, this is database data, and then this is, of course, files that your application may create. So if you have a web application and it's creating like images or storing PDFs or JSON files or whatever, then you got to make sure that the system is storing those to a volume that's mounted on the host. Otherwise, you're going to lose it all. But that's a good question. Thank you for that. This question was asked by, I can't pronounce the name. I think it says his name is Sasha. What do you think is the right moment in development when we should put our application in Docker or introduce any kind of virtualization? So I believe it's worth introducing Docker in a dev environment when you have multiple developers working on the same thing and they're all in different environments. And this is because of the whole, works on my machine problem. Like, it's one of the most annoying things, and you can completely resolve that by just using Docker in this way. And then it's worth introducing it in prod if your host machine needs to run multiple versions of the same thing. Obviously, if you have a simple application and you have a server that just runs that application, then Docker may not be what you want to use. Now, keep in mind, you can use Docker only in prod. You can use Docker only in dev. You can use Docker in both places. You can use Docker in no places. So it's not like you are committed to Docker and only Docker. Your application is still a thing that runs on a particular port. You should, of course, have a configuration file that describes how your application runs anyways. So it'd be perfectly fine and acceptable to run that bare metal if you needed to. Okay, so we got 1 minute left. We're probably going to run a little bit over. I don't have a ton of questions left. There's only 3. And then we'll wrap this up. So about 15 more minutes. Just hang in there. Colin Padgett asks, what does Docker do that a VM doesn't? So this is kind of related to another question. I decided to answer this separately because it asked the question kind of in a different way. So the one thing Docker does that VM doesn't is that it contains a large repository of pre-built images that you can use. And this is something that isn't really present with virtual machines. Like, there is this concept of appliance with a virtual machine, and this is basically a pre-built virtual machine that you can load in, but it's not the same. You got to download that. It's the full image. It could be a gigabyte. And then you got to import that into whatever's running your virtual machines. and then and only then can you run it, whereas Docker is a lot faster. The other thing is Docker containers start almost instantly, and that's because it's not booting a whole operating system, it's just starting a set of processes that is contained within this thing we call a container. And because of that, it's very fast. It also uses host resources instead of requiring the reservation of resources. And this can be a big thing, because you have to section off a bit of RAM for virtual machine. You got to say, all right, well, this virtual machine gets 2 gigabytes, but my system only has 4 gigabytes. That leaves me 2 left over. But if that virtual machine never uses even close to 2, well, oh well, you don't, too bad. That memory is reserved for that virtual machine, and that's what it is. But with Docker, you have no such problem. Docker doesn't reserve resources up front. It just uses the resources from the host. Next question is from Bipit. Explain it EM style. What is Docker Swarm and when should I use it? So the intent of Docker Swarm is to run many copies of many containers across many hosts, and with emphasis on many hosts. If you're just running it on a single machine, then it's less useful. But the whole point of Docker Swarm is to say, I have this application, I want to run 20 instances of it, I want to run 4 instances of the database, and I want all of this spread across 5 servers. Then Docker Swarm is the technology that you would use to make that happen. And Kubernetes is another thing that's like Docker Swarm, but Docker Swarm does it in a different way. Whereas, like most simple Docker examples, they typically apply to single hosts only. Like I have this server, I just want a database on it. I have this server, I just want my application on it. And that's it. You don't need Docker Swarm to run 2 containers. But if you're doing a very large deployment, then it makes sense to, Docker Swarm, like Brian Scott just said, Swarm is almost obsolete. And in fact, in 2 years, it's going to be obsolete because they are not maintaining it. So, but the question was about Docker Swarm, so I'm answering it for Docker Swarm. I suppose my third bullet point would be, don't use Docker Swarm, use Kubernetes. And then the final question from Ferb. When running a full stack application using Docker, do you use 3 separate containers to run your back and front database, or just 1 container to run it all? So this is related to Kaylee's question. Kaylee, database for sure will get its own because the vendor provides one. You're going to get it directly from the vendor, and of course all major vendors have images already. This includes MySQL, Postgres, Mongo, etc. So you're just going to grab it straight from there, and you'll be good to go. Now, if the backend and frontend would ordinarily be served from the same web service, it makes sense to lump those together. And again, look at your port layout and say, okay, well, all right, well, if I have an API that runs on port 2000 and I have a web front that runs on port 3000, it probably makes sense to switch those to individual containers. And another benefit about doing 2 containers instead of 1 is that you can scale them independently. So if you want to scale your API to 10 instances, but only scale your web service to, scale your web front end to say 2, then you can do that easily. If you had them in the same container, you'd have to scale both of them to 10, and that could be problematic. That would be wasting resources, and it would probably be things running that aren't even being used, and that's not ideal. Okay, so we've reached the end of the pre-submitted questions. Let me just look through the chat and through my question log here to make sure I haven't missed anything. If you have any questions, this is your last opportunity to ask it. Donovan asked, not sure if it's asked before, but what's your thoughts on using Docker instances for game server hosting, multi-instance dedicated hosting? So running game instances in Docker is becoming increasingly popular because oftentimes setting up a game instance is not very straightforward. So by being able to lump all this into one Docker container is actually pretty attractive. So I know when I operate a Rust server, I actually operated that in Docker and it worked perfectly fine. So I'm fine with it. I think it worked fine. Point asks, would an Nginx proxy container be a lot slower than running Nginx on the host machine? Yes. So you could actually run a Docker container for Nginx, which contacted the other containers. The reason I chose not to do that is because I really wanted that to be bare metal. I wanted to terminate SSL on the host, and I didn't want to do that through the container, because then I'd have to have let's encrypt in the container and all that. So could you do it? Yes. And it might make sense to put Nginx in a container if you want your application to use Nginx. Like for my use case, for a PHP application, PHP application wants to use Apache. So what I've done is I've put Nginx out in front. I've used a reverse proxy into the Apache container, which is also running the PHP application. So it's actually 2 web servers. So it would not be a lot slower. It'd be about the same speed. I think in this case, it's just a matter of, for my use case and for the amount of maintenance I wanted to do, it makes sense to have the Nginx running process on bare metal rather than having it in a container. Let me look through the chat. You can't trust containers for DB servers. Performance can suffer from it. Not really. I mean, in terms of computing, the performance won't suffer. If you're doing like if you're making a lot of database queries and they transfer a lot of data back to the application, then you might incur a small overhead from the network side of it. But from the actual computation, it should be perfectly fine. EM, please show Chase after you're done with the content. Okay, let me see. Chase, come here. Hey. Chase, you want a treat? I don't know where he is. He's somewhere. I wish I could show him, but I can't even find him. How do you launch a container via code? You would just run Docker run or Docker compose up if you've described it via Docker compose. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I think I got everything in the chat. I got everything from my questions log. I think, yep, all good. Okay, so of course my final bit is, if you are not on the Engineer Man Discord, you're gonna wanna get there now. There's almost 10,000 people on there, and that's due largely to the whole server discovery thing. So if you have knowledge, you should come share it on the Engineer Man Discord. And if you need knowledge, you should come to the Engineer Man Discord and ask for that knowledge. The server is more active than it's ever been. The message velocity is about 2 times as much. I think we're doing about 200,000 messages a month at the moment. So there's a ton of stuff going on there, and you'll want to check it out. And it's only growing as time goes on. And the people that are finding it through server discovery, they want to discuss technology. They found the server because they were looking for a place to discuss technology. So there's tons of like-minded people, and it's completely worth checking out. As far as the stream, I'll be publishing all these notes right after the stream, and I will be reconvening here in about a month. Also, there's a channel called Stream Planning on the Discord server, and this is where we as a community decide what we're going to stream about once a month. So if you want to take part in that discussion, that's the only place that happens. There's no way to give input on the streams in any place other than Discord. So you can check it out there, and you can recommend topics or whatever you'd like to do. And then, as always, thank you so much to everybody who attended the stream. I saw a lot of first-time viewers, so if this is your first Engineer Man stream, 370 people. That's actually a massive stream for this channel. I think it's the only time it's been over that was the 500 one for installing Linux from Windows. So thank you for everybody that attended. And if it's your first stream, thank you so much for checking it out. And I really hope that you come and check out a different stream. Sip Kodak, munchies for the dog. Thank you so much. And hopefully I was able to answer your question good. I saw that you had a question in there. And then for those that come to the stream every single time, oh, we're at 400 now. That's fantastic. Oh, 407. So for those that come to every single Engineer Man stream, thank you so much. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to the team. And I know that everybody's getting a lot of benefit out of this. You know, we always put out a lot of information. We don't do any fluff on this channel. We don't do any of that. No BS. Just straight to the content, straight to the data, straight to the facts. Nothing else. So I think we'll just wrap it up at that point. If you want to go further, I'm also on my own Discord server all the time. It's not like I'm not there. So you'll see me interacting with people. You can come say hi, ask me a question. That's perfectly fine. And I hope everybody had a fantastic stream. I hope to see you on the Discord server and on future streams and in future videos. So other than that, have a fantastic, terrific rest of your weekend. And I will see you when I see you. Oh, Donovan, thank you very much for the 70 there. Appreciate that so much. So catch everybody later. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend. Take care.